Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for attending our event, a very special colloquium on 30 years of Tibet-China dialogue engagement, current perspectives in a time of global realignment. My name is Richard Haddock, Program Manager with the George Washington University's East Asia National Resource Center. And I'll be talking a little bit about some logistical notes, as well as introducing some of our co-sponsoring organizations, and introducing the convener of today's colloquium, Professor Tashi Ramki. So introducing a few of our co-sponsoring organizations, we have a fantastic lineup of organizations helping to convene this colloquium, including the Research Initiative on Multi-Nation States, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, the East Asia National Resource Center, and the Elliott School of International Affairs. The Seeger Center for Asian Studies is a university research institute and the academic home of the Asian Studies program of the Elliott School of International Affairs. Its mission is to increase the quality and broaden the scope of scholarly research and publication on Asia, promote US-Asian scholarly interaction, and educate a new generation of students, scholars, analysts, and policymakers. And the East Asia National Resource Center at the George Washington University is supported by the Title VI provision of the 1965 Higher Education Act and is jointly managed by the Seeger Center for Asian Studies and the GW Institute for Korean Studies. The program offers a multifaceted approach which emphasizes both academic excellence and public accessibility. And Title VI education, the Department of Education acknowledges George Washington University as a national resource center for East Asian studies for events like today. So both the NRC and Seeger Center share a vision for increasing this important intersectional critical dialogue on issues of importance in Asia and indeed to the world. So that's a bit about a few of our co-sponsors, and I'll leave Professor Ramki also to talk about RIMS. But on to our convener. I'm very happy to introduce her to the audience today. Tashi Ramki is Research Professor of International Affairs at the Elliott School and Director of the Research Initiative on Multi-Nation States. She's also the founding director of the Tibet Governance Lab, an incubator for research on policy challenges and innovation in the governance of contemporary Tibet. From 2008 to 2014, Dr. Ramki led the development of the TGAP Forum, a research initiative that engaged PRC scholars and official policy researchers in Beijing on questions of Tibetan's governance and policy issues. The academic dialogue process generated new insights on the institutional structure and the dynamics of China's policymaking in Tibet. Dr. Ramki holds law degrees from Oxford and Cambridge and a PhD from Harvard University. She was a public intellectual fellow with the National Committee on US-China Relations from 2011 to 2013, and a visiting scholar at Sichuan University in 2015. Please join me in welcoming our convener, Professor Tashi Ramki.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Tashrafke, and welcome to our first in-person RIMS event. And so it already feels like a special program. And I know some of you have come long distances. Some of you have driven here, some of you have flown here. So I will start by welcoming you first to George Washington University, also to the Elliott School of International Affairs, which is sitting on the traditional lands of the Piscataway Nation and peoples. I know a lot of people think of Washington, D.C. as King's Landing, but I start with this land recognition, especially because RIMS is a program that seeks to reframe how we think about the nation, how we think about the state, and make visible those parts of the world, nations and peoples who did not become a nation state when there was that big rush in the middle of the 20th century to do so. And yet they have regional stakes, they have territorial presence, and they have distinctive political subjectivity. So places like the Basque Country, which of course is an extraordinary example of an autonomous region in Spanish state, but also places like Kurdistan, and I know we have a great champion of the Kurds right here. So hopefully in this day that we have, this afternoon we have together, we'll be hearing from these diverse perspectives as well. And we're focusing on Tibet. And I wanted to say a few words. I feel like I know many people here in this room, but there are also people I've heard for whom this is their first program to talk about and listen to talks about Tibet. So I want to say that my own work has been over the past 20 years based inside Tibet, driven by field work and working with a lot of people who are researchers and scholars in Beijing and Shanghai and other Chinese cities across the People's Republic of China. So today we are talking about the global dimension of Tibet politics. So it is a new initiative, this colloquium, and to be hearing from someone very special. We have such a special guest today. This is the Sikyong, who holds the highest elected office in Tibetan exile system, and he has had such a busy week. He found time to be here at the university to join us. So it is important for us to be having this conversation because we are in a brand new moment. I'm sure it has escaped no one that China is on everyone's minds. It's a topic at every family dinner table across this country and around the world. And yet the understanding of Tibet has never been so poor. So what we're going to try to do with this colloquium, and by listening to people who have great expertise, who have experiences in being a part of Sino-Tibetan dialogue processes, is to reset that public conversation and to really talk together as a public conversation about where new initiatives or new research initiatives could be going. So with that, I'm going to introduce our director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, who is going to be welcoming our special keynote speaker. And this is Professor Greg Brzezinski, who some of you may know. I know that there are people who are very active with the Seeger Center here. Greg is a professor of history and international affairs. He's director of the Seeger Center, but also acting co-director of the East Asia National Resource Center. So maybe he can tell us a bit about that. He's the author of 2 books, Nation Building in South Korea, as well as The Making of a Democracy, Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War. His articles have appeared in numerous journals, and he's now working on nation building projects in other venues, including America. So thank you, Greg, for being here, and I'll let you have the podium.
Okay, thank you, Tashi. Let me, just start this event. This is a, great event. It's my pleasure to be here. I want to recognize Dr. Rabgi for all of the amazing work that she's done in organizing this event and managing to get an in-person live event before the end of the year. So we're especially delighted that she was able to do that. And also just to recognize all of the fantastic work that she's done as part of her research initiative on multi-nation states. I also want to just briefly recognize as well the efforts of our staff. Several of them are here, and they've put a tremendous amount of work. Richard and Adam, and I think Yingzhi, I also saw her here before. So yes, thank you. A couple of other staffers, Amanda and Shruti also are here. So I just want to, thank all of you for all of the efforts that you've put in. Well, as Seeger Center Director, once in a while, I get to introduce a distinguished guest. And today's guest is especially notable and distinguished And we're very pleased and honored that he would stop by the Elliott School and the George Washington University as part of his stay in the DC area. I think it's a great guest, and hosting these guests is part of what makes the Elliott School so special, and part of what makes our Asian Studies program so special, and what makes our centers so special. So Tashi was coaching me on the pronunciation of the name. I'm actually, as Tashi was mentioning, I actually work mostly on, Mandarin and Korean are my languages. So I'm gonna do my best here. But today's speaker and guest of honor, the Honorable Sikyong Pempat Tserin, became the second democratically elected Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration on May 27, 2021. He was elected to the Parliament of the Central Tibetan Administration for 2 terms from 1996 and 2006. Following this, he became the Speaker of the 14th and 15th Parliament between 2008 and 2016, and between 2001 and 2008, the Sikyong served as the Executive Director of the Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center in Delhi. He was born in a Tibetan family in the Bailakupi refugee camp in Mysore, India. He completed his education at the Central School for Tibetans, Bailakupi, and the prestigious Madras Christian College, India, where he earned an honors degree in economics. During the Sikyong Students' Days, he also served as the General Secretary of both the Tibetan Freedom Movement and the Nigerian Tibet Friendship Association. Later, he served as well as the General Secretary of the Central Executive Committee of Dome. So please join me in welcoming today's featured speaker, the Sikyong Pempat Tserin.
Thank you, Director Greg. I think you did a very good job with my name. And now I can understand that Dashira is a good coach. I met another student of Dashi yesterday at the State Department in the US 8, an Indian, an American of Indian origin. So thank you very much, Dr. Rabke, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And I want to thank all the partners, Research Initiative for Multinational States, RIMS, East Asia National Resource Center, SIGA, Center for Asian Studies, also for facilitating this. Let me, because this is a colloquium, so it's meant for scholars and academics, and I'm not a scholar, nor am I an academic. So let me just take you through to what has been happening since we came into exile about on engagement with China. The interaction between Tibetans and Communist China started only when Communist China started its incursion into Eastern Tibet, 1948-49 onwards, and then that invasion of Chamdo in 1950, that also led to the signing of the 17-point agreement under duress in 1951. We tried to live under the agreement for 8 years, till 1959, but unfortunately, China transgressed on all the provisions of the agreement, and His Holiness was forced to flee into exile in 1959 to India. And from that time onwards, there have been a lot of repressive policies of the Chinese government, leading to the Cultural Revolution from 1966 6 to 76, where a lot of things, not just in Tibet, but in the whole of China, anything old was destroyed. And in Tibet, 1.2 million people became victims of Communist China's aggression, directly or indirectly. About 6,000 monasteries in Tibet was destroyed. By around 1973-74, when the Cultural Revolution was going on in full force in the whole of China, including Tibet, His Holiness started thinking about a way out to preserve Tibetan identity. But it was not pronounced at that time. When His Holiness' elder brother, Elliott, went to, on the invitation of President Deng Xiaoping, after the death of Mao Zedong, had a liberal view and had a discussion with Elliott that we can talk about anything else other than independence. That also led to some fact-finding delegations into Tibet by the people in the Central Tibetan administration. That was our first major engagement and going into Tibet to understand the situation inside Tibet. And under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, there was also liberal-minded Chinese leaders like Hu Yaobang, who also visited Tibet and decided that some 85% of the Chinese should be sent back to Tibet so that the Tibetans can concentrate on the development of Tibet. Then, around 1984-85, for almost 2 years, we sent 2 exploratory teams to see whether dialogue is possible between the Tibetans and the Chinese, but the conditions were not favorable during those times and there could be no progress. And then His Holiness traveled to the United States for the first time in 1979. And since then, he has been visiting the United States, initially once in a year and later several times in a year when His Holiness was much younger and energetic and proactive. Then by 1987, His Holiness spoke to the Human Rights Caucus in the United States Congress about the first initial overview of what he called as the middle way approach. Middle way is a Buddhist concept avoiding extremes. So one extreme is the present condition of China's occupation of Tibet, and the other extreme is before China's occupation of Tibet, Tibet was. So based on that, he proposed the 5-point peace proposal, and the 5th point was on negotiation. And he expanded on that 5th point in the Strasbourg proposal in 1988. And at that time, there was some scope for dialogue. But then there were obstacles on the way and things could not take off from there. And by 1991-92, I think His Holiness spoke at Yale University saying that I tried my best to reach out to the Chinese government, but since there was no positive response from the Chinese government, he said all the proposals he made are now off the table. But since then, His Holiness asked the Tibetan people as to what course should we take. So he wanted a referendum among the Tibetan people in early 90s. By 1994, in his 10th March statement, he mentioned about this. And in 2 years, I also became a member of parliament in 1996. And we were one of those teams who went around the Tibetan communities explaining about the options that we had, whether we should go for complete independence, or whether we should go for middle way approach, or whether we should go for truth insistence or self-determination. So these were the 4 choices. But before the referendum could be held, the larger opinion of the Tibetan people was that we should leave to His Holiness to decide on the future course of our engagement with China, depending on the situation inside Tibet, in China, and in international community. And the parliament passed a unanimous resolution in 1997 that His Holiness, we will abide by the decision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and His Holiness again stressed on the importance of the middle way approach, and we still follow that. And my administration is also committed to continuing with the middle way approach that will seek, that is based on nonviolence as a means to find a mutually beneficial, lasting solution for Tibet. So how much ever we would wish, we cannot take Tibet out of that plateau, out of that landmass into some other place. So Chinese and Tibetans have been neighbors, and we have to remain as neighbors. So as neighbors, we have to learn to live in peace. So the content of the middle way approach also provides for the Tibetans to be willing to live under the provisions of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. And since 2002, we have had about 9-10 rounds of dialogue with China up to 2010. Maybe that was a strategy on the part of Chinese to not have obstacles on their coming out party, the Olympics in 2008. But just as soon as the Olympics was over, then that guys also got exposed that China is not keen or serious on resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict. And since then, there have been no dialogue. Now, under the present circumstances where we have a very evolving global scenario, and there will be a lot of things to watch out for in the next few months as to how this Ukraine crisis will unfold and how the international community will reshape its global order under those circumstances. What will happen to Russia? How will China be viewed by the international community? And what are the opportunities for people like the Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the Mongols, and also Hong Kongers who are also facing similar problems as Tibetans, as even though the issues are different, the contents are different, historical backgrounds are different. And on my part, on the administration's part, under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as I mentioned before, we remain very committed. Some people ask me the validity of the middle way approach or the middle way policy today. And I feel that it cannot be more valid than today, because this is based on nonviolence. And we have witnessed as to how much violence has affected peace around all of us. That's what is happening in Ukraine today. And we feel for the Ukrainian people. When, as things started unfolding on the Ukraine crisis, even though I was very busy with my parliament and all that, parliament session and all that, every evening I returned back home to listen to the news. And I felt very, very at unease. And today also at the Hill, I was mentioning to one group that if there is an initiative from anybody to go to Ukraine as civilians, I'll be joining them. Let's see if civilians can go there and then how the aggressors react to this situation. War is not going to give us any result. We have seen how much money goes into those wars, how much destruction, loss of life, property. That's why nonviolence is the only and best way to resolve conflicts. But going back 5-10 years, particularly during President Xi Jinping's time, I met one Chinese scholar about 5-6 years ago, and he was telling me that President Xi intends to consolidate all his powers. And we have been witness to his policies as to what is happening and what happened to Hong Kong over the years, and the industrial scale of cultural genocide in Uyghur. I don't like to call it Xinjiang, but there's a Chinese name for East Turkestan. So I call it the Uyghur people or the Uyghur land. That is very, very unfortunate. Even in Inner Mongolia, as what China calls, they like to be called as Southern Mongolians. In Southern Mongolia also, the population of the Mongolians in Southern Mongolia is just reduced to 15, 16%, and the rest are all Turks and Chinese, so there's not much scope for the Mongolians to fight for their identity, for preservation of their identity. And under the present circumstances, I don't see much hope in the immediate future as to a positive response from President Xi's government on their willingness to talk to us. But then we have to remain positive. We have to remain hopeful to seek a mutually beneficial solution to the Sino-Tibet conflict. And I remain hopeful. In the meantime, we have decided to study the situation inside Tibet very carefully. Since we are the spokesperson of the Tibetans inside Tibet, we have to present the reality of the situation inside. If Chinese have made progress, we should accept that. And wherever there are deficiencies, wherever there are policies and programs that does not help, that does not benefit the Tibetan as a people, Tibetans as a people, and China as a nation, it's our duty to point it out to them, and that's what we'll be doing. And as and when we see a scope for future engagement with China, we'll be willing to take up that opportunity as well. So I'll leave it to that. I think I know Greg is looking at his watch, and I have about 15 minutes to finish my presentation, and I welcome any interaction that follows. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a fantastic address. And Tashi charged me with being the moderator here. And so she said I can sort of ask a couple of questions or make some, additional remarks and then call on people from the audience. And so, I'm not an expert on Tibet by any means, but I did have sort of one thought during that very interesting speech. And by the way, I have a habit of looking at my watch. I wasn't trying to rush you or anything. It also measures my heart rate, so I had to see how fast my heart was pounding during that exciting speech. But I would say, one thing I was sort of interested in is how you see the U.S. role in the current environment. I mean, as I see it, because I've also studied U.S.-China relations. And of course, there was a period during, the Cold War when there was just strict antagonism between the United States and China. And the United States was actually trying to, do different kinds of covert operations in Tibet and Xinjiang. And I know that's not the term you like to use, but then then we went through the 1970s, 1980s, this period of very strong relations between the US and China, where there was a lot of strategic cooperation, and the US was very hesitant to criticize China on a lot of issues. And now we come to today, where there's sort of this renewed era of Sino-American rivalry and Sino-American friction, but there's still also some areas where the US needs to cooperate with China. And so I'm just wondering how you see the US role fitting into some of the things that you spoke about.
Thanks, Director Greg. Our association with the United States active association goes back to 1956, when some of our people were trained in guerrilla warfare by CIA, starting from Saigon, coming into Camp Peary around here in Washington, D.C., and then on to Colorado, up till about 1968, just before, maybe we can say up to 72. We have our former Chief of Cabinet, Mr. Tenzin Namgyel Tetong here, who became representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the North Americas in 1973, when we were asked by the US government to close down our office. And initially that was set up by them in 1963-64 in New York. So at that time, there was not much political engagement. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to also to mention a name, William Woodville Rockhill, because at one time I wanted to do a study on how the Tibetans came into the United States. And then my study also went back to, then I wanted to know who was the first American to come into Tibet. And that was William Woodville Rockhill. He was born in 1854 in Philadelphia and then moved to France and studied Tibetan language in his teenage time. And came back to the United States. He found that was not his life. He went back to Europe. But while he was in the United States, he studied Sanskrit and Chinese to understand more about Tibet. And then he went to Beijing in 1885, worked in the American legation, as it was called, not American embassy. And he worked there for 5 years. In 1889, he went to Tibet for the first time. And then again, he went to Tibet in 1891, again, under the support of National Museum and Smithsonian Institution. Coincidentally, he was the ambassador of the United States government in the early 1900s when the 13th Dalai Lama went to Beijing. So that was perhaps our first diplomatic relation, an American ambassador meeting with the 13th Dalai Lama in 1908 at Utaishan. So just to give you a little background on American-Tibet relationship. So now US has been very supportive about Tibet. US perhaps is the only country who has a legislation on Tibet that's binding on the Congress, on the administration to report to the Congress within 2002 Tibet Policy Act. Earlier than that, US government appointed special coordinator for Tibet in 1997. Before that, in 1991, April 16th, if I'm not wrong, that was the first time His Holiness addressed the US Congress. Elsie Walker is also here. Some of our very old friends are here who were instrumental in some ways, along with our offices, Office of Tibet, to organize that. And we have had very good support from the US government. Now, when I come here, I came with two proposals. One is how do we push the like-minded countries on the issue of Tibet. Unfortunately, the Ukraine crisis came up, but fortunately, that also united NATO. So I think there's a lot more space for the United States to lead this movement, to work with like-minded countries to support or to bring out the Sino-Tibet conflict on the forefront. And I got assurance from the administration and the Congress here that even though Ukraine is in the spotlight, we have not forgotten Tibet. And the second part is the communist Chinese leadership's narrative on Tibet is so strong, their propaganda is so pervasive that now, including academicians, consider Tibet as a part of China. As Chinese government says, since time immemorial. Earlier, it was 8th century, 13th century, 18th century. Now it's time immemorial. Now, when is time immemorial? We don't know. So there has to be a change on the narrative, because the fact is that Tibet was an independent country. It's not just the Tibetans saying that. His Holiness has mentioned many times, because he cannot lie, and he doesn't want to say that Tibet is not part of China also. I think he's one of the best diplomats in the world. So what he said was, let us leave history to historians. What is more important is to seek happiness for the Chinese people and the Tibetan people in the future. And we have to live together as neighbors. So that is why he followed the middle way approach. But many people don't realize that we have climbed down from independence to middle way. And Chinese government has always been asking or pressurizing or demanding other nations to say that Tibet is part of PRC. if you visit China's Tibet website, you will find any leader coming from Central Asian countries to say that Tibet is part of PRC. And a lot of other countries do that, all countries except one China policy. But on one hand, you say Tibet is part of PRC. When you say that, you are going against the international law. Because the one agreement we have with China is 17-point agreement. And that was signed under duress after invasion of Tibet in 1950. So that is unfair agreement under international law. On the other hand, yes, today Tibet is occupied by China. That is the reality. When you say Tibet is part of PRC, then again, you are telling the Chinese government that you do whatever you want in Tibet. We are not going to interfere. So that's why China also keeps saying, as of day before yesterday, after my meeting with Czech foreign minister, they kept saying the same thing, that His Holiness is a separatist. So this, when you, same as what is happening to Ukraine, we are all watching from outside. So when you say Tibet is part of PRC, then you are giving freedom to China not to interfere in Tibet. Now, on the other hand, countries keep saying we support negotiation between the Chinese government and the representative of His Holiness or the Central Tibetan administration. We find that contradictory. Then there's no reason for China to come on the negotiating table. Because if everybody accepts Tibet as part of PRC. Now the question is, why does Chinese government keep insisting on other governments to say that? Do you find other equivalents in any parts of the world where governments try to seek legitimacy through the international community? No, China is the only one that tries to, because they know that they don't have the legitimacy. So they are trying to seek this legitimacy from the international community. And the international community kowtowing to China's demand cannot give legitimacy to the Chinese. It's only the Tibetans who can give legitimacy to the Chinese. So therefore, it's imperative, or for us, it's very important to recognize the historical independent status of Tibet. And that leverage should not be given away. So if we give up that leverage, then there's no scope for future negotiations. So how much ever you say we support negotiations, it's not going to help. Just by raising human rights issues inside Tibet, it's not going to help. So therefore, we need to change this narrative. We have to counter China's narrative at the global level and at the local level. And our engagements in the last few days with the White House, with the State Department, with the leaders, including Speaker Pelosi at the Hill, provides us ample opportunity to present the 16th Cabinet's view or perspective on how we want to move ahead. And there will be a lot more engagements, there will be a lot more initiatives resulting from our meetings in the last few days. And I really look forward to a proactive engagement with the United States government and its leadership in getting the like-minded countries together to allow China to come to the negotiating table.
Thank you for such a detailed answer. And so what I'm going to do now is take a few questions from the audience, and some of our staff are prepared with microphones. Just what I want you to do before you ask the question, of course, is to be sure to introduce yourself and give your full name and affiliation. And I would, of course, be remiss if I did not give the first question to our trusted Associate Director of the Seeger Center, Professor Deepa Alapalli.
Thank you. And thank you so much for those very, very thoughtful remarks. I must say that I'm Deepa Alapalli. I'm a professor of international affairs focusing on South Asia. And your comment about the middle way, whether it's relevant right now or not, I think we just have to look at the fact that the dominant principle of realism has really not done a good job when we look around at the international environment right now. So thank you for bringing that into the lexicon. Greg raised the question of the US role and how you view that. And of course, having another powerful, much closer country that is very much important for the Tibet-China dialogue is India. I see that you went to the famous MCC for your college. And so you probably have a very good understanding. But as you know, at the same time that the US relationship with China has deteriorated in the last 2 years, 3 years, since 2020, Indian relations have also nosedived because of the border conflict. And many people, we think that there's been a turning point because over all these decades, we could say that India has been extremely careful in the way in which they handle the Tibet issue vis-a-vis China. And many would say that it really did not use that issue to its advantage, to the advantage of the Tibetans. Right now, there is some change. One can see, for example, this notion that every time the leaders meet, then you have to say Tibet is part of China. I don't see that happening every single time in recent years, which it used to happen. So when you look at the Indian position, if the relations continue to deteriorate between India and China, do you think that this is an opportunity for Tibet in some way? Or do you think that it's going to pose greater difficulty for Tibet? And I don't want to bring in questions like the Arunachal Pradesh, which is South Tibet for the Chinese, and how that all plays in. But in an overall sense, how do you view that? Thank you again.
From an ordinary person's perspective, if there is any conflict between any other country with China, then we look at it as a positive development. But if one wants to be realistic, His Holiness has always appreciated better relations between India and China through many decades. We still follow the same because there has to be peace. If there has to be peace, there should be good relations between India and China. But not at the cost of the Tibetans, not at the cost of the Tibetans. So the Tibetan side, the cause of Tibet remains very much in there. We have been the buffer all along history between China. Till China invaded Tibet, there was no Sino-India border. It was always India-Tibet border. Even now, you still have the Indo-Tibetan border police. Even now, you have the Indo-Tibetan border force. And last August, I was on the border in Ladakh. I visited all the Tibetan nomadic areas. And we went very close to the border. Just across, we could see the Chinese listening post, this side, Indian listening post. So this depends on how you view it. But the belligerence from the Chinese side, unprovoked belligerence from the Chinese side, whether it was to do with Doklam before, Galwan now, and the continuing standoff, is not helping anybody. Not helping anybody, and not for the region, not for the countries concerned. So there has to be better understanding. And this, again, leads me to see, why is China doing this? I sense a lot of insecurity in the Chinese leadership with the trade war, spotlights burning on the Indian border, threats to Taiwan, conflicts in South China Sea. Why is China doing all this? I sense a lot of insecurity because China is the only country who spends more money on internal security than the external security. That itself shows a deep distrust or a lack of trust between the people who rule and the people who are being ruled. So for the Communist Party, I think presently the more important issue is the sustenance or the continuation of the Communist Party's rule in China. Why is China doing this? if there is a threat to the Communist Party, then I believe they will take up one of these hotspots, create problems there, to raise nationalism inside China, and to force China's communist rule in China. Without the Communist Party, there is no question of international relations, there is no question of trade with others. So what concerns the Chinese leadership right now is the continuation of the Communist Party. That is my perspective. And our relation with Indian government, if it is not for the government of India, we will not be where we are today. So we remain forever grateful to the government and the people of India for their sustained support, more on the humanitarian front over the last 6 decades. And it's because of India that I'm here as Sikyong, not only the benevolence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I myself always, whenever I meet with the Indian leaders, I always tell them, physically I might look Tibetan because I was born in South India. I have never seen Tibet. I never had the fortune of seeing Tibet. So I always try to go to the borders and see Tibet through the fence. And that's the closest I can come to, to emotionally fulfill my wish. And just for your information, we feel very much Indian because our language came from India. Our religion came from India. And spirituality is what shapes your mind and your way of life. So we think alike. We have the same values. And in fact, Tibet must have been, Tibet is one of the repository of one part of ancient Indian culture or wisdom. Because Tibet must have had the biggest transliteration house in the world as far back as 8th century, when we translated all the Sanskrit Buddhist texts into Tibetan, and today it's in the process of translating back into Indian languages. So we are an extension of Indian culture. And after assuming my role as Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration, I've had interactions with the top leadership in India, and I have always maintained that we will have a very transparent relationship. And I have no doubt about India's intentions, even though His Holiness used to say that when it comes to China, India is overcautious. And today I can say maybe you can remove the over, but still cautious, but in a good way. I look forward to the continued friendship with India.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for your excellent lecture and for taking some questions. Unfortunately, or well, fortunately in some ways, we're going to need to move ahead to the next phase of today's event, which is the roundtable. I know there are some of you who had questions that you would have liked to have asked the Sikyong, but the good news is that he has agreed to stay with us for the roundtable. So you will get some subsequent chances to ask your questions later on. So thank you all very much. And let's just have one more round of applause.
Thank you, Greg. And as Greg said, we're going to have more opportunities to be interactive when we get to the roundtable. But actually, we have a diversity of voices. And this is part of the logic of this colloquium. We wanted to have more talking about the issue from different standpoints. We have these conversations because we know that we don't all see it the same way. And so before we get to the roundtable, we have 3 very distinctive and important talks that I'm still looking forward to. And so I would like to put this out on the table too, is that the way we use the word dialogue, already, I think in the conversation we've had since 2 o'clock, we've been talking about dialogue in 2 different ways. One is capital D dialogue, which is the thing that I think everybody wanted and expected, which is that one day the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, is going to sit down with Beijing and have a dialogue. That didn't happen. But there is another kind of dialogue that did happen, small d dialogue, which is understudied, underappreciated, and yet for 30 years, this has now been part of creating a new Sino-Tibetan history. and it has carried on. And we have people here who've been part of that history, some who are not speaking. I'm sure he will not be happy if I mention it. Vujitsuda has been part of that process, but we have somebody who has been part of this process for a very long time, whose career in government service, in the exile government service, spans so many different aspects of the history of the past 30 years. And this is Tibet-China. I'm so delighted that he is going to speak on this topic that he doesn't always speak on, but he was a former governor in Tibet, which we call the prime minister in exile. And he was also the leader of the second delegation that was invited to Tibet by Beijing in 1980. So since that time until now, so much else has transpired. There have been intermittent conversations going on, interactions going on, and Ginzala, as you can see from his bio, I hope everybody picked up a copy of the speaker bios because it's really extraordinary how he has served all of this effort in many different functions and also has been an institution builder. So many things that you have probably heard of, including the International Campaign for Tibet, which here in this city everybody has heard of. In this country, Ginzala has been part of creating. So we are delighted that he is going to share with us his perspective on something we do not hear enough of, which is the very early years of this multi-dialogue process that took place between exiled Tibetans and the Chinese government. Ginzala?
Thank you, Monsignor and everybody. It's a privilege to be here and to speak along with so many distinguished speakers and guests here. This is a big topic as far as Tibetans are concerned, and I just didn't know how I could begin without having a proper background introduction. But I think the speaker covered most of it, so I can maybe move along a little faster. But I've been asked to say a few words about the history of the dialogue process that happened over the last 30 years. And I think we have to start with the establishment of the People's Republic of China. When Mao declared his intention to, quote, liberate Tibet. And by 1950, an actual invasion, not unlike Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, took place. And of course, far superior Chinese forces overwhelmed the Tibetan. Very difficult roads, but we survived. We toured every day, and we were accompanied by United Front officials from Beijing, and in different parts of Tibet, local, provincial, and municipal officials, Chinese and Tibetan, also accompanied us. And in the course of this 3 months, we visited small towns, small villages, nomadic areas, and also visited a few show and tell places, like a small motor mechanic, car repair shop in Ngaba. And the best we could see was a big blanket manufacturing factory in Congo. Beyond that, there was very little to show, actually. And but what we saw at practically every stop was the monasteries and temples in ruins. Practically every part of Tibet, everything was in ruins. And we communicated with ordinary Tibetans. We communicated with Tibetans who were working with the Chinese. Finally, I mean, this is a very long story, but end of our visit was in Lhasa. And there, the public welcome and the public display was just incredible. Before the first delegation had visited Tibet, Chinese officials in Beijing were not sure if the Dalai Lama's representatives would really be welcomed by Tibetans after 20 years of great progress. In fact, instructions were sent out that guests were coming from outside connected to the Dalai Lama, and people should be courteous and make sure no stones are thrown or something to that effect. But when the delegations actually arrived, first, second, third, fourth, wherever we went, we were swarmed with people. People just wanted to touch us, people wanted to talk to us, people looking for lost family members, people just talking about the suffering their village or their family went through. So the entire trip was highly charged and emotional experience for, I think, everyone on these delegation tours. Finally, we arrived in Lhasa, and I said the display was so pronounced that when we, I think the second day when we, our first visit was to the main cathedral, the temple in Lhasa, sort of the holiest temple in Tibet. When we arrived at the gates of the temple, it was probably about 100 or 200 feet away. It probably took us an hour to get through the crowd because people wanted to touch you and people were weeping. Very difficult for all of us. And the five of us in our group had also already visited different parts of Tibet where we had family members. Some very close family members, others not so close. And one in particular, I remember, is one of our members, Kuzo Wangyal. He had not seen his mother for 20 years or heard of her. And when he finally got to his hometown in Rombatsang, he heard that his mother had died during the Cultural Revolution, punished or mistreated, and she had died, and her body was just thrown in a small riverbed, and for days nobody dared collect it. So there were experiences of that sort which had a tremendous impact on us. So anyway, that was how we were received in Lhasa. And then on the second day, we went to visit Ganden Monastery. This is one of the, maybe the third largest monastery in Tibet. And it was completely destroyed in ruins. There's some dramatic pictures you've seen. And when we got there, several thousand Tibetans had arrived. Ordinary Tibetans, truck drivers had commandeered some 80 trucks and just hauled people up there. So when that happened, the following day, we were told to cut our visit short because we were instigating the Tibetan public. So that was not the best ending to our trip in Tibet, in Lhasa, but we had to leave. And as I mentioned, each of the delegations then finally went back to Beijing, and we had an opportunity to speak about all of this to Chinese officials of various ranks and responsibilities. We were also able to speak again with Benchen Rumchi, Nabima, Chingmin, and Kunto. And so the fact that so much destruction and extensive human suffering had occurred in Tibet was more than amply confirmed by these delegations. And if it were not for Mr. Hoyabang, much of what we said then to the Chinese officials and what we say now may have been debunked as Tibetans getting too carried away and too prone to exaggerating Chinese evils. But around the time the second delegation was in China, Hu Yubang, then the party general secretary, also visited Tibet. And he had a big sort of public event where he said, in 20 years, it doesn't look like we've made much real progress or brought about any major development. Hu Yubang also began the process of withdrawing some 80% of Chinese cadres back to China, so to speak. So what this first phase of delegations that toured Tibet only helped confirm the extent of misrule in Tibet. And I think forever, no Chinese official is going to say things were wonderful in Tibet after 1950. So this was the first phase of sort of, now I'm making it the second phase of this dialogue and diplomacy. Following that, in the early 80s, which the Sikkim also mentioned, another delegation of senior Tibetan leaders then proceeded to Beijing. And we had a series of meetings, but as the Sikkim mentioned, it didn't turn out too productive. And I think I should mention how I summarize that as the Tibetans were very keen to find out what were the new possibilities now, because the delegations had gone. Ho Yabang had openly admitted to a lot of shortcomings, and the Chinese government was inviting new delegations to come. So on the Tibetan side, His Holiness representatives were eager to find out what was next, in store. But it soon turned out that maybe things were already changing within the Chinese political mindset, but the Chinese officials were beginning to talk more about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, focusing more on if he would return, when he would return, where he would return, and if he did return, would he assume some official role in China? Whereas the Tibetans were looking for new ways to deal with the Tibetan issue. And before this dialogue kind of died out, other big changes took place in China. Ho Yabang died in 1987, I think, or 87. And soon after, there were student protests, and then everything led to greater protests for democracy and the whole crackdown on the Tiananmen Square. That essentially brought an end to a lot of things people like Ho Yabang and other leaders in China were trying to reset. So that's another period of dialogue that ended. And so only almost 10 years later, in 2001, right? 2001, around 2001, this next stage of diplomacy happened when His Holiness appointed two special envoys, many of you know, Rohit Yari and Kyesan Kyaltsen, and they took on this responsibility with a great amount of skill and determination. And their primary sort of task in some ways was to keep the engagement going with the Chinese government and then to explore what was possible from the Chinese end. So they had a number of very successful sort of interactive meetings in Beijing. And on the Chinese side, they were also keen to know precisely what the Dalai Lama or the Tibetans wanted. Was it still independence, or as they suspected, was there some kind of a hidden agenda, or what was on the agenda of the Tibetans? So I think the two envoys were able to convey very clearly that what His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the exile administration was pursuing was what the Colloquium described as the middle way policy. Essentially, what it meant was that His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the exile administration was no longer going to contest Tibetan independence. They were going to be willing to discuss and settle for a genuine autonomous arrangement for all the Tibetan people within the PRC. This means essentially all the Tibetan-speaking people and Tibetan areas on the Tibetan plateau. So to simplify it, it was these two positions. And I think they carried this process along quite successfully, and even towards the last meetings, the Tibetan side presented very specific details of how this could be worked out. Along the way, 2008 came along, the Olympic hype was taking place, and a whole new round of protests happened in Tibet. It started in Lhasa, and then it spread throughout Tibetan areas. Many Tibetans are calling it the second big national uprising. So protests happened throughout the Tibetan region, and that may have indicated the will of the Tibetan people very prominently, but at the same time, it may have also reignited fears and suspicions in the Chinese official. So by the end of 2008, they had another urgent meeting because it was kind of a chaotic situation at the time. But by 2010, as we know, the envoys meeting with the Chinese came to an end. Unfortunately, beyond that, nothing has happened since then. So it's an unfortunate ending. But I would like to end by saying that it shouldn't appear so we shouldn't appear too pessimistic, because if we look at this whole process, Tibetans and the Chinese, Tibet and China, have had successful dialogues and interactions, not just in the recent time frame we're talking about, but throughout history. Maybe from 1300 years back. That pillar over there is a testament to one successful dialogue between China and Tibet, where during the 7th and 9th centuries, where there was conflict and war between Tibet and China, there was dialogue, there was resolution, and recorded on these pillars that still stand today. So we have a history of such a dialogue and success, and even by this current developments from 1950 onwards, the 17-point agreement, as well as all these delegation tours and the envoys going to Tibet, it shows that even in the worst of times for the Tibetans, or maybe even for the Chinese, dialogue and some effort to resolve this conflict is there and is desirable both for China and Tibet. As far as the Tibetan people are concerned, I think history, as well as recent history in 70 years, it's proven that the Tibetan people consider the survival of their culture, their identity, not up for compromise at any level. Yet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans are willing to find a way forward in a peaceful way to resolve the Tibet issue. And for China too, I think, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that it could be in China's interest. China is a global power, militarily, economically, politically, but China needs to learn to live at peace within and with the rest of the world, and maybe opening up a new dialogue with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans will open that way for them. Thank you.
I want to thank Prince Lama for giving us this very personal look at a process that really demonstrates how much learning there has been over the past 30 years. And I know there are a lot of questions. I feel very cruel for stopping them all, but hold them until we get to the roundtable and we get to listen to two other perspectives. The first comes from Professor Xiaoming, who I've been saying that we don't have enough conversation publicly, especially with Chinese scholars, and he's one of the very few who has been a champion out there, very prolific in writing both in English and in Chinese. And so he's going to give us his perspective. He's a political science professor at the City University of New York, and has a hybrid background, educated in China as well as here at Temple University, where he did his PhD. He has written books and actually is a very frequent columnist. So I'm sure those of you who follow the Tibet issue know of Professor Xiaoming from his many projects. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, let me get started. So this is I can think about when we talk about big D or small d dialogue. So I think here my dialogue is in 5 points. But I do think this dialogue has been very challenging, very difficult, and but I think it's important. So this is why today I'm going to talk about some of the dialogues I have been involved, and so I put this dialogue across the Himalaya. Since I hosted 2 forums for His Holiness Dalai Lama and CUNY and Harvard College and the Graduate Center, so I put a picture right there. So when His Holiness was greeting historian Joseph Lee at his university. Okay. So First, let me say a few words about my rendezvous with Tibetan exile. So I was never trained as a Tibetan specialist. Actually, I was not trained as a China specialist. I was trained as an American specialist when I was in China. But I came to this country, so identities were imposed upon me. Unfortunately, I was thrown into the existence of this world, right? So I have to keep reinventing. The crucial moment, I met His Holiness Dalai Lama on May 5th, 2009. And that was a very important date I can remember because I just finished the documentary movie, China's unnatural disaster, The Tears of Sichuan Province. I am one of the co-producers. And we had the premiere at HBO headquarters. So I was invited to meet His Holiness and Waldorf. And so I brought this with me and to present to His Holiness. And so you can find, and that was the moment I was at age 44. So in Chinese superstition, when you get this double four, means double death, right? And so I was stepping into this kind of massive black forest like Dante, and he started with his holy, his divine family. So at that moment, because I was working on the Sichuan earthquake project on China, it was a heartbroken project. Since that, you see, trip, I have never been to China anymore. Not only I think it would be difficult for me to go back, also because I have been on bad terms with the Chinese government. So the Chinese government has since banned me and declared me as a persona non grata and to return to China. So this is how, and I sense that was a big mountain for me to climb because after I finished climbing on the tenure track promotion, associate professor, full professor, this kind of stuff. So I was looking for my second mountain to climb. So now I was presented with Himalaya. And so I got, involved with Tibetan exile, of course, and I got the call from His Holiness. And I remember once, and he held my hand, and he said, because I said, I'm going to write a book about you. He said, but write in Chinese. Write to my Chinese, please convey my message to my Chinese brothers and sisters. So you understand, and when you look at a scholar, so my resume was not nice for the past 10 years. Why? Because I took a big detour to get into His Holiness Dalai Lama. That's, an ocean of wisdom. So this I took time to understand. I try to educate myself about Tibet. That's not easy because I have to understand Buddhism. But Buddhism, that's not easy either. Then I have to understand India, right? In order to make sense of everything. That was not, good, the easy task either. So this is how I think I did, take like Himalaya to try to climb. And of course, here I have the second mountain, another is because when I was climbing the mountain in Himalaya area, and so I realized my body was not functioning very well. So I got in and out of Mountain Sinai 3 times. And so I was thinking about, yes, and both Himalaya mountain and the Mountain Sinai, and they approached me at the same time. And so now I traveled, this long journey, of course, and I traveled with Sikang and Pemba, and Pemba, and you can see that was more than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I was with him, and he was young then, and I was young then too, right? But I can say, Pemba lost some weight, but I think I gained a lot of weight. So we had also another time is 2017, and we had the journey. And in the SUV to travel, right, for more than 10 hours in the midnight, we enjoy milk tea. And so this, so I met Pamela when he was the speaker. I met him when he was the representative on behalf of His Holiness and for North America. So now I'm very happy to say him again and as the Sikang and for the Tibetan Central Administration. So now I wanted to say even my dialogue and is in Cyprus. I can tell you it's important because in the eyes of the Chinese government, it's even subversive. So I don't want to scare some of our Chinese brothers and sisters, right? So I just want to mention, if you look at the national value, national security value, right? And because for Xi Jinping and the Tibet, of course, is about the unity of the country. It's about his great ambition for the reunification of the entire country. So if he wants to get Taiwan, if he even cannot keep Tibet, right? So of course, that's a disaster for him. And so this is why it has national security value for him, and also for the United States, it has national security value because it can be a national security concern for this country. Okay, so I just want to remind you, so we had many activities to host the Tibetan visitors. This is a representative of North America, and Tanzania was there, and also Minister of Education were there. So we had a banquet to welcome them. And also, so this is when I was at Dharamsala and with the former sitcom Dharamsala. So we try to do all this kind of dialogue, and I also try to understand what's going on. So now I just give you here the screenshot from the DOJ. DOJ published this, and the 5 individuals charged, right, with stalking, harassing, spying on U.S. presidents on behalf of the PRC Secret Service. So I read it, I see something very interesting. Okay, so in Civil Communications on November 22nd, 2016, Wang Shujun, Wang, and he got the instruction from the MSS handler, right? And instruct him and to meet, you see, attendee and pro-democracy events in Queens and to accomplish the task assigned by the boss. And so because this guy and try to understand Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians, right? And so this is how you can find there is a big assignment from the Ministry of National Security. Okay, so if you understand, that was exactly the conference I just held in Queens and also at the NYU campus. And so here you can find, and from this picture you can find, and not only we have prominent Tibetans, you can see Kuchunga is here, and the vice president for international campaign for Tibet, right? And you can find Lobsang and Yanzha, right? The North American representative of His Holiness, and now the president for Dalai Lama Foundation. You can find here Kong Takahashi and was there, and he was Dalai Lama's Chinese affairs legal officer. Of course, then you can find and Uyghur people and Anwar, and he was pushing for Han and his release, right? And so also we have Ili Shati, and now the president for the American Uyghur Federation. And so you can find one important thing is basically we can talk about here. We have an assembly of so-called 5 points or Urdu. So if you understand the Chinese is the language, so we have the Duli, right, independence movement, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and also Falun Gong, and the Chinese overseas democracy movement, 5, right? And so now we have to add Hong Kong, so now we get 6 points. And by the way, the 5 points, this term was invented by my student. I supervised and his dissertation. His name is called Chen Jin, you know, and he finished a doctorate degree at the University of Sydney. And so this is something we should keep in mind. You understand why they wanted to spy on our conference. So at the very beginning, the prominent speakers I did briefly arrange myself. Lobsang Yanzha was a speaker, and the very beginning, and Buchang was there, and Kong Dala was there, right? And so you can also find here Yang Liu, right? And Emery is there, and Paul Fong Han from Johns Hopkins, right? And Peter Huang, the late sociologist and Cuny Graduate Center, and also Ian Buruma was there, and of course Gordon Chen, and he said. So you can find and how we can try to understand the issue. But of course, here I want to give you a picture is because if you pay attention to Chinese affairs, just a few weeks ago, one Chinese overseas prominent lawyer, Jim Li Jingjing, and the far you see here is the left, right, was killed and in Queens. So this is a big event. So you understand here, when we talk about even the dialogue in fine print, so we can say spying, we can say you see the blood, right? So this is what of course, I do not want to scare you. I don't want to scare myself, right? But I just want you to be aware. If the Chinese government, they care so much about, and if they are sending people to spy on a person like me, I'm a scholar, I'm very transparent, they can understand whatever we have been doing, I think, and it's significant. Okay, so this is the list of the people here. So now I just want to look at the Tibetans in exile, how I'm going to understand them. So I understand from three perspectives. So one is political movement. But in terms of political movement, we can find the middle way approach, right? It's changing from independence, right, and from the full sovereignty, from nation state, right, into genuine autonomy. So this is what we have heard. Then the second, of course, is socio-economic movement, especially when I visited refugee camps. I could see Tibetans, they were struggling and to survive and to develop and also to pursue prosperity. What I admire most is, I think, Tibetan movement is also a cultural spiritual movement, and it has great success because I am thinking about how Tibetans in exile, they have made Tibetan culture and also their struggle part of the mainstream thinking and in the West. So that this is what I think is important. So we can understand how the swans, right, fly to the lake, to the lake in the West. And so Dalai Lama played an important role. And so I always think about if Wardowski wrote a book, Dalai Lama as a political leader. This is why I said I want to write a book and the Dalai Lama as a political leader. Then Dalai Lama said, no, don't write in English, write in Chinese. So this is why I took the detour. So when I look at Dalai Lama and as a political scientist, so what I am saying, okay, good. Give me 1 minute so I can finish here. So I think Dalai Lama and offer leadership to the Tibetan community in exile and changing autocracy to democracy. Second, I think Dalai Lama has making contribution to improve the quality of democracy in India. Third, I think Dalai Lama is offering inspiration and also vision for the Chinese democratization movement. Fourth, I think Dalai Lama has a vision and especially to work with Buddhism and Gandhian non-violence philosophy, and also democracy and to invention of possible Asian unity. The last thing, if you look at Dalai Lama's concern about the third pole, the environment in the Tibetan plateau. So I believe Dalai Lama is offering global balance and is offering a lot of ideas. So this is why I think Dalai Lama is someone we should know, we should understand. So as a Chinese, of course, I wrote a book on them. So I call it High Peaks Flowing Rivers on Tibet. So let me explain to you. Many Tibetan scholars, they look at the high mountains of Tibet. They are like the very powerful and the solid tradition or culture, but they are more in a static condition. But for me, I approach Tibet by making friends with the Tibetans in exile. I think they are the flowing rivers. They are dynamic. They are easy to adapt, to reinvent themselves. They have embraced the open society and also the globalization. So this is why I think I want to understand Tibetans. They are like the rivers, but then the water eventually is going to evaporate and into the atmosphere. Then they become snow and cover to nurture the ancient Tibetan civilization. So this is how I think, and for me, and yes, and the journey was difficult, and the journey and was not directly helping me in terms of my scholarly pathway. But I can tell you, when I was focusing on my writing on Sichuan, I was so depressed I could not carry on. But after I finished this book on Tibet, suddenly I realized now I have the mindset to return to my Sichuan earthquake book. So now I'm completing my Sichuan earthquake after this big detour. So this is all. I just want to thank you and so for your attention. So here is where I talk about and in front of his audience. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Xiaoming. I think we can see right away that Professor Xiaoming has given us a very different sense of the dialogue than Dalai did. So that's a very different perspective. And we have yet another very distinctive perspective that I've been so looking forward to. I know many of us have been talking about this next presentation that's coming because the speaker, Ajahn Rinpoche, is a very highly distinguished Lama, also scholar. He was the abbot of Kumbu Monastery, which many of you will know how important Kumbu Monastery is to the whole Tibetan religious framework. But he was also, at the same time, he was a top-ranking official in the National Buddhist Association in Beijing, while also having this very honored position in Tibetan Buddhist Network. And so he has insight into the world of the Chinese institutional system during his lifetime growing up and being an official inside Tibet. So during the Cultural Revolution, he spent 16 years in a forced labor camp. So he's endured an incredible amount of suffering, and you can read it in his book, Surviving the Dragon, that is out. So please do look for it if you can. We have a copy out there. You can take a look as well. But Rinpoche, since he has been in America, since he came first to Guatemala, right, yes, and then to America, right? It's an incredible story. He has been doing work that's completely unique, that involves Tibetans, but also involves Mongolians. And today, for the first time, we get to hear him speak about what his views on the dialogue process are and what that political sensibility is. So thank you, Rinpoche, for being here.
Thank you so much, Tesla, and our distinguished Sejong and all professors and scholars. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I didn't prepare lots of things, so I talked to Tesla the other day. What should I say today? Then just whatever you want and your background and so forth. So my background, she already almost gave the details, so I don't need to talk about a lot. Then myself, my name, you all know, Arjay Losam. Now people call me Arjay Rinpoche. Anyway, so I was born in 1950. And 1952, I was 2 years old. Then monks from our monastery, they found me as a reincarnation of their abbot. So then I went to a monastery. I grew up in a monastery. And my life was very interesting. Then, you know, the monks, they don't know how to take care of a 2 years old baby, but they respect me and they treat me as a little prince in the palace. So I, then 1958, so there's a dramatic change in my life. Actually, my life was turned to upside down because there's a political movement called Great Leap Forward and Religious Reform. So all senior monks are arrested, then the rest of the monks went to field to work. I was 8 years old. I was sent to a Chinese school to study Chinese. Then I can't wear my robe. Then I'm wearing a uniform and to a regular Chinese school. Then after that, I was in labor camp during the Cultural Revolution, she mentioned. So anyway, all of that, then starting the 1980s, the policy was changed in China. So Angela just mention that I recall that, in 1979, the first delegation come to our monastery, Kumbum. So the Juchen Toto is the head of this delegation. They had a lunch in my residence. So I remember that was almost 40 years ago. So anyway, after that, then back and forth, and then Tibetans and Chinese had some dialogues, the government level. That's in the stop. But the personal level still going on. So my topic is the strengthening communication can solve the problem. So I guess we're, personal level, we should do more communication. That's all I'm saying. So I would like to share some of my experiences or my personal story. So since 1998, so then because of my background and everything, so my political position also raising up, then step by step. Then finally, I became the vice chairman of Chinese Youth the Federation. Then I became president of Buddhist Association in the provincial level in Qinghai province. Then also vice president of Buddhist Association in China. Then later I became the vice chairman of the Qinghai Provincial Political Consultative Congress. So then also a member of the Central Chinese Political Consultative Conference. And later on, I was promoted the standing committee, but that time I already escaped to US. So, but anyway, so those are my background that time. So why I mentioned that, because of that, then I joined lots of meetings and conferences and special events in China. So then also I had the chance to make some connections with the very high Chinese officials. So in Chinese high officials, party leaders, they're thinking where their view has a very complicated situation. One of them are very open-minded, very liberal. They want to do something for the China, and they want to do for the Chinese system, and they want to work with the Tibetans and the ethnic groups like that. But on the other hand, the conservative parts are very different. So they don't want to do all of them. So I would like to share a little bit of personal story that time. So I remember in 1990s, I became an abbot of the Kumbum Monastery. Then I had a chance to meet people and go to different places to have a conference and visit and so forth. So one time, our monastery had a big exhibition with the art sculpture, which is very famous art in our monastery. We had this exhibition in Shenzhen. So then I was invited the previous Panchen Lama, 10th Panchen Lama's mother, to join our that's exhibition. Because that time the Panchen Lama, old Panchen Lamas passed away, then she felt lonely and like that's then at that time she asked me, she wanted to meet very special old friends in Shenzhen. Then the person is Xi Dongxun, which is the Xi Jinping's father. So then we were very happy to do that. And then we went to his residence. Then he was in a wheelchair. So, but he's very spirited. Then they talked, we had a very long discussion with the past and the present and so forth. So he is a very important person. He is one of the founder of the communist China. So during the Cultural Revolution, he had some problem. Then after that Cultural Revolution, he came out in Shenzhen. So after that all conversation, before we leave, so he all of a sudden, he just holds two palms and raised to his forehead. Then he said loudly, he said, in my lifetime, there are two masters. One is the Dalai Lama, the other one is the Panchen Lama. I always pray them to protect my, protect us forever, something like that. And I was really surprised. So that is the, now the president of Xi Jinping's father. So then said that. Then, of course, there was a thing happened, but then also I understood a little bit because they're inside thinking. So the second story is when I was in the Kumbu monastery one day, 80s, I guess, 90s, one important person coming. So then later on, he was the Deng Gufang, Deng Xiaoping's son. Then he came to our monastery and visited our monastery, accompanied by the deputy governor from our province. So then he's on his wheelchair. He's the chairman of the handicapped, what that's federation called. But I mean, he's head of that. Then after our discussion, our talk, and I gave an introduction for the Kumbu monastery and so forth. Then before leave, he was unexpectedly, he asked me to bless him. Then I was a little bit surprised, but I immediately stand up and he's on his wheelchair, but I then went there and said mantras and the prayers and the blessing to him. Then he said that you bless our whole entourage, one lady and some other people, maybe his bodyguard and like the soldiers and so forth. And then I did everything. Then afterwards, then our deputy governor was very shocked. So how come Deng Xiaoping's son secretly practiced Buddhism? So that is a very interesting thing. So, but anyway, then lots of those kind of stories, but I don't have time to share all the details. But one other thing is our provincial party leader. He's the top person. He's a really good person. Now he already passed away, but I don't want to mention his name. But then he and me had a very close relationship. Then his wife, also a party leader, then always come to Kumbu. Then one day he requested me, I want a little Buddhist altar or shrine. Can you make arrangement for me. Then I did. I made a little Buddha's altar for him, and I delivered them at night, then put in his house. And I don't know his husband, but him herself was practicing. So then that's, you can imagine, you know, like party leader at home has a Buddha shrine. So that's almost unthinkable. But anyway, that's all I experienced. Then one other thing I would like to share with you, which is 1986. So the 15th, the World Buddhist Congress was held in Kathmandu, Nepal. So the Nepalese government invited go to the conference. Then I was his Dalai Lama's religious secretary. I had the chance to visit the Nepal too. So before we leave, we're so busy and preparing everything, and you know, prepare the gift for the some other people like that. And then one insider of the party came and kind of telling him that you might prepare a extra one gift. You might have a chance to meet the Dalai Lama in that time. So then he was super happy, Dalai Lama. We all thrilled. Then that's just a great thing. Then we prepared the gift and everything. Then finally, the Chinese government announced, they said, no, Dalai Lama can't come to this conference. If Nepalese invite Dalai Lama, Chinese delegation will withdraw. So then we're very sad, but anyway. So then we went to Nepal and for that conference. Then the Nepalese are afraid of China. Of course, they are very afraid of the India as well. So then finally, His Holiness didn't come to this conference, but his delegation came to this conference with Indian passports. That's a diplomatic procedure. So anyway, so then the Chinese side, they made a very actively made this arrangements. So the delegation come to a Chinese embassy to meet the Dalai Lama and so forth. So after all, my point is, some important party leaders are so disappointed. They said, wow, we don't understand why the Chinese government make this kind of a decision. This is a great opportunity two masters can meet. Maybe that's a great opportunity to have a dialogue with the Tibetans and Chinese. You know. So maybe that's a good opportunity to serve that complex Tibetan issues. So that's where all missing kind of that's opportunity. So that's one thing. Then the last thing I would like to share is conservative, one of the leaders' action I would like to share. So the person is Li Tieying. So Li Tieying is a very important Chinese high leader, but he always go to some special events. For instance, the 10th, 11th Panchen Lama's reincarnation. He went to Tibet for the golden urn ceremony and so on. So he participated in all of them. But he and myself had some kind of relationship. I would like to share that. So in 1991 or 2, he came to Qinghai, Hong Kong. So he wanted to meet me. Then he was asking the Tibetan tradition and Tibetan religion and the customs and so forth. And then we had some discussion. Then that time I didn't know anything, but he already planning that how to find the 10th Panchen Lama's reincarnation. That's the government can control. So then later that year, so there's big events in Tibet Autonomous Region, which is the 40 years anniversary of peaceful liberation to Tibet. So then I was invited to events because our delegations from Qinghai province. Then they hold a big opening ceremony in Tibet Public Art Center or somewhere. So it's full of hall and full of people. Then on the stage has very important guests. We all on the that's audience like that. Then that's just like a general conference, and had the Chinese anthem first, and the kids go to the stage and present the flower to the Li and the Li hug this little kids and showing this kindness and so forth. It's all done. Then we all sit down. Then start to next program. Then all of a sudden he stand up. He stand up with that flower bouquet, and back his back up his body, and he threw this flower to the audience. Then everybody was a little bit shocked. What's going on? Then he directly threw this to a Rinpoche. So Rinpoche at that time is the head of the search committee for the Panchen Lama's reincarnation. So then everybody was a little bit surprised and focused on him and quiet. Then somebody just figures out what's going on maybe. So then plowed, and then that's a thing that's over there at that time. Then after that, then we had visiting this photo exhibitions and everything. So then the central government, the delegation also visiting there. Then somebody want to introduce me. This is Arja Gucci from Qinghai province and so. So then he said, I know him very well. So he was, we're shaking hands, and then he was holding me. He wanted to say something. Then I can't, leave. So then he said, so do you see that events? So it's a great. Then I say, yes, that's wonderful. Not just wonderful, it's very auspicious. Maybe this is some kind of, blessings from the previous Panchen Lama. I can't help myself. I just, out of control, I just throw that flower to the Rinpoche. So that means the next Panchen Lama will come to autonomous region of Tibet, that's territory. Not the Amdo, not the Kham. Please cooperate. You mean that's thing. Then I say, oh, why? I know. Now I know what's going on there. So anyway, those kind of thing I want to say. So I guess my time is up, but I have some stories, but I didn't organize so well. So anyway, so my main point is, so in our Chinese leader have a two part. One is open-minded, they want to do something really reality, But the other one is kind of playing this kind of random trick and to fill this Tibetans or something. I guess that's also doesn't work. So my saying is only the dialogue and the understanding and the communication can work. So this is a kind of little my talk, and thank you so much, you all. So I will stop here.
Let me point out the obvious, which is that what Ajahn Rinpoche has just shared with us, the stories that he has just explained, should give us all pause. They're extraordinary experiences, the insight that he is presenting here. And it's no coincidence because Rinpoche is so talented, he's so gifted, that I think he has been sought out again and again inside the PRC and has the ability to earn trust and confidence. And I think you can all see that Rinpoche has much more to write. There's a lot that we hope to see in print. And in fact, that's one of the conversations around this event, this colloquium. We were thinking to have a publication come out from the different experiences, but especially Rinpoche Gadiche is so incredibly important. We are going to take a break and then come back. I hope everyone is going to have processed the different insights that we've heard from the laying out of the whole the last 30 years of history, as well as Professor Xiaoming has shared with us the real issues of surveillance that happen at the same time. So we'll take a 10-minute break. We're reducing it, so sorry, but that's because we can have more conversation together with hopefully the Sikyong doing the roundtable. So 10 minutes from now. Thank you.
Wow, good afternoon and quite a late afternoon. And hello, everyone. Judge Dele and 大家好. I'm very honored to be invited and to be present with such a distinguished group of guests. But I will cut the formality and just make some public disclosure upfront. And I'm tasked to talk to the Chinese audience in the larger audience and to share my Chinese perspective and experience. But I'm not, because I cannot see any audience on my screen, so I will just do whatever packed my notes. And with them, and the Chinese nationals in my mind. And the second one, I want to assure them, maybe just by citing one, constant recurring episode I do, so that they know that they feel a little bit safer here. That is, whenever some activist students ask me whether I'm pro-Tibet or pro-China, my simple answer is always, I'm pro both. That is, I support all peoples in their struggles for justice, equality, and freedom. Okay, and the second one is that, maybe I should skip this, but I want to quickly mention that the way I use the term Tibet includes, other Tibetan regions outside of the Tibet autonomous region. That mainly in other 4 Chinese provinces, Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan. So whenever I use the term Tibet, I refer to what is called the Greater Tibet. And this is not such a big deal. I think if you are Chinese, you think, the term Greater China. Would that offend you? So this is in a similar spirit. I use this, Tibet to refer to the Greater Tibet. So since I assume that most of the young Chinese here who probably I'm curious, obviously, but I want to know more. But probably I need some kind of a knowledge. So I'm more kind of like teaching. I'm trying to connect my personal experience and observation with the larger changes on the ground. So make the two to run together, and kind of like also like teaching a small course. So first, I'd like to share with the audience 3 moments that connect my experience. The former truck driver turned a serious student of Tibet with the larger changes in the past 4 decades. From there, I offer my humble reflection. Now, the first moment is 1980. Hu Yaobang, the general secretary of the Communist Party, led the highest delegation to visit Lhasa. And he made a formal apology to the Tibetans for the mistakes of the recent past. And then announced the very radical changes in new policies by that time, okay, in 1980. Of all his policy directives, most important and unique to Tibet was an increase of Tibetan officials to a two-thirds majority in the TAR. The spirit of this policy was not really new, however, as it was aimed to achieve the twin objectives of national unity, meaning the whole China, or PRC, and local autonomy in minority regions. So this is actually consistent with the visions of Chairman Mao and especially Prime Minister Zhou Enlai that were articulated in the first decade of the PRC. So don't think the Greater Tibet idea or the Dalai Lama's midway approach is something new. It's actually in line with the Chairman Mao's and the Prime Minister Zhou Enlai's visions. Okay, so these twin objectives were first actually officially formulated and encoded in the 17-point appointment. This is another thing I want to point out to this is a Chinese history. Okay, it's not some other wild version of modern China. It's official, okay, Chinese history. Okay, let's go back to read the 17-point agreement. Not personally now. When that official news outlets reported Hu Yaobang's speech, I was a college student in Xining, and I joined my Tibetan friends for a celebration, and I saw some of them actually, many of them actually burst into tears. And also many Han Chinese, students and intellectuals, longtime, residents of Qinghai, also, celebrated for this because they also felt released, and especially the Han Chinese officials have to work on the higher level and sacrifice their health. They really loved it. Okay, so all this actually, all this, of course, are part of embarrassing the broader changes in a new era. Okay, so all this validated Hu Yaobang's pronounced justification for these policies to satisfy the central government, Tibetans, and Han Chinese officials in Tibet. This is a high moment of optimism for me in my entire life up to this point. Okay, now the second moment, let's fast forward, okay, to 2001. This is kind of a little bit arbitrary choice, but I want to find a place that kind of a transition to 2008, that is the third moment. Okay, so fast forward to 2001, the visit by the Dalai Lama's elder brother to Beijing. Okay, many things happened during these past 2 decades that can be summarized in 2 narratives. On the official political level, the major events include the official fact-finding missions to Tibet, the stunning real facts that these missions uncovered that result in a deep sympathies among many Han Chinese, but alarmed the hardliners in Beijing and fanned their paranoia of another 1959 style uprising. So this is the result. All the Tibetans, of course, are familiar with the episodes. And I don't think I have the time to go into that. I would teach a course on that. So then you see that, 3 years, 3 executives from 1987 to 1989, Tibetan protests, okay, that of course result in 1989, the largest revolt inside Tibet since the Dalai Lama left. And of course, then it's brutal crackdown, and then quickly followed by the June 4th massacre. of the Chinese students in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere. Of course, then shortly later in that year, the Dalai Lama received the award the Nobel Prize in Peace. So all those kind of culminated into a crescendo of in a way success, I guess, international campaign, and internally, but also the beginning of a series of more tragic events to come. So, of course, within the CCP, Hu Yaobang was removed from the top leadership in 1986 and died in 1989, which actually led to the Chinese student protest movement. And of course, after Tiananmen, in the 90s, there's a certain kind of a partial reversal of Hu Yaobang's policies in the 1990s. Okay, so but at the same time, during the 2 decades from 1980 to 2001, there is a second parallel narrative that is about the ground, the kind of incremental, quiet, but the changes on the ground in the everyday life of Tibetan. So it's kind of a zigzag pathway of 2 decades. But overall, you see, several things that was very positive. First, the religious and cultural practice returned to some level of normalcy, and the major monasteries was rebuilt and restored. Tibetan language education was reinstituted with varying degrees of success. And of course, most successful model is in Amdo, where the previous Panchen Lama had established the first Tibetan language secondary school in his hometown, in Xinhua County of Qinghai province. So that was the first one after the Cultural Revolution. And also restriction on the cross-border travel exchange and partially relaxed. And also a mix of a basic economic freedom, coupled with kind of this pro-development, government state-sponsored development. Overall, benefit ordinary Tibetans. These are quite achievements on the ground, but mostly ignored by the first narrative, that is the international kind of a political high politics. So these 2 narratives, on one, high politics, international, outside the PRC, and the other one, they're really kind of formulated, kind of bifurcated Tibet. In other words, Tibet exists in 2 separate worlds, so that rarely talk to one another. I'm not talking about the PRC Beijing thing. It's on the ground. Actually, I returned after 11 years. I left Xining in 1986. I returned there in 1997. Then since, I've been on the plateau, some part of the plateau, for 12 times. And so I saw this kind of a zigzag movement and step forward and step back, kind of but this is something that happened during the 2 decades. So the 2001 visit broke the ice and opened a small window of opportunity for official dialogue. I said the 2 worlds rarely cross each other. So for more reformed-minded Chinese leaders, the successful bidding for the 2008 Summer Olympics called for some serious conversation with Dalai Lama and other Tibetan leaders in exile to ensure the ultimate success of the Olympics. So along with the further meetings in the run-up to the Olympics, however, I saw a steady decrease of trust. Or maybe, there's not much trust to begin with, but still, the increasing distrust on the part of Beijing, or the international movement for a free Tibet was perceived to threaten their primary agenda for national unity and the social and the political stability. So traveling, that's exactly the period, those years I traveled every year, basically, between the 2 worlds, and mentally kind of crossing borders. I hope that the 2 narratives converge at some level to create a more constructive environment for negotiation. And I was so heartbroken when that window was finally closed in March 2008 with a even more tragic ending for Tibet than March 89. So this is a fast forward 2 decades later from, 1980, I saw the largest revolt after, the Dalai Lama left. And then 2008 is even bigger. And of course, and everyone is familiar, even the young Chinese, you still have some memory of that. I think if you are in the 20s, you probably remember what happened on the Chinese media. Okay, all the street violence in Lhasa, and of course, probably you probably know little about anything else. So finally, the third moment, that's 2008, and all the events surrounding 2008 Olympics. Now, of course, this is I was not actually. I was first alarmed by small protests in Rigong. Okay, that is in Amdo, the Tongren County in Qinghai. And I feared that would be the precursor for something much bigger to come. Then, that is in February 2008, the tribal dispute between a Tibetan and a Hui Muslim vendor quickly escalated from peaceful protest to a violent riot. And then the predictable eruption in Lhasa that quickly spread to other areas, mostly concentrated on the borderlands of Amdo and the Kham, that is in Qinghai, Gansu, and Sichuan provinces. Why do I need to highlight the geography of conflicts in Lhasa and the Tibetan borderlands? This is because the people-to-people relations began to change in the 1990s with the increased migration of ordinary Chinese to Tibetan regions, these borderlands and the Lhasa, and the subsequent economic competition and cultural assimilation that inherently disadvantage the local Tibetan population. So, this is first time. Why I'm saying this? Because before 1980s, there were virtually no Chinese, common ordinary Chinese in Tibetan regions because the travel into Tibet was strictly forbidden. Okay, so most of the Chinese inside Tibetan regions, they are basically two, government officials, functionaries, and then professionals who are more like, doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers, these people. So they are the educated group and highly disciplined, of course, and much better behaving. And so they left actually very positive impressions on the, local population because these are not, the old Kuomintang or even older, the Qing Manchu, Sichuan warlords who fought his way to Lhasa and rampaged the whole place. So this is a new Chinese, okay. But from 1990s, things began to change on the ground. So that's why I want to point out this, okay. What went up to 2008, okay. This is kind of a new source of Tibetan grievances, okay, that erupted in Lhasa, and you look at the map for 2008 Tibetan protests. It was mostly concentrated in Lhasa and other larger cities, and of course on the borderlands of east and northeast, Amdo and the Kham. So I guess I'm running out of time, right? Okay, well I better cut it short. So let me say, this is the first time, okay, and I was heartbroken to see, well, the social fabric began to, fracture and indeed erupted, and it's not the high politics anymore. And it is ironically the first time the two parallel narratives, high politics and the ordinary everyday life kind of converged into this, Tibetan nationalist movement. And of course, on the flip side of that is a kind of it's added a lot of fuel to the burning fire of Chinese nationalism that is going on inside China and, of course, even in domestic Chinese communities. And in the run-up, especially around the the rallies of the torch rallies. Okay, that really kind of you see the first time in the history that this is a division and kind of even at some level hatred. Okay, erupted among the two groups of ordinary peoples. Okay, so this is the most alarming. So let me fast forward. I mean, because I'm tasked to, I will skip something here. And now this is the most grim. Now, in addition to what happened in the past 12 years since 2008, and I think that we have, in a way, if we don't repair this people-to-people relations, okay, there's no, we have, I mean, we are approaching, honestly, the point of no return. Okay, and of course, they already reached that in Xinjiang, but that's another story. So what can we do, ordinary citizens of any nationality, about that? And I think from sporting, don't do harm, educate yourself, okay, about the history, the culture, and of Tibet, okay? And especially, this is my kind of, a standard line for, in talking to Chinese. That is, if you really, believe and insist on Tibet being part of China, then treat Tibetans as the equal citizens, okay, of China, okay? And then you, especially, you want to, embrace the Tibetans as equal citizens, listen and understand their grievances and hardships, and help their families and friends, and help your families and do the same, and educate more people around you. And if you could do something good in areas that you can still help, such as environmental protection, cultural preservation, and education. The bottom line for my Chinese compatriots is do no harm. Thank you.
So much, Professor Yue. And we're going to now have the roundtable. Our other panelists are coming to the front so that the audience can be interacting. I don't know if you want to stay online. And, but anyways, well, we're getting seated here.
Okay.
I'll just say a word to introduce you, Joseph, because we're delighted that we can finally get to the roundtable, and we have discussants who are going to pull together thoughts on all the presentations that we've had, including down to Professor Yue. And the first is Joseph Turian, who some of you may know is a professor at American University, and coming at these issues from a political science, international affairs point of view. He has actually driven a very long distance to be here today. So Joseph, I'll let you take it away.
First of all, thank you to Professor Yue. It was a very interesting talk. I do teach at the School of International Service at American University, but I'm on sabbatical this semester, so I've been spending a lot of it back home in Metro Detroit. But I really did not want to miss this particular event. The reason Professor Rapke asked me to provide some reactions to the talks that you've seen today are because I'm writing a biography of an individual whose name you've already heard today, Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping. And the story of Xi Zhongxun is in large part also a story of Tibet from the 1950s through the 1980s. He was head of the Northwest Bureau in the early 1950s, which included a lot of Tibetan lands when they were incorporated in the early years of the People's Republic of China. And it was during that time that he became very close to the 10th Panchen Lama. In fact, they enjoyed a very close relationship, and you can find a picture online of Xi Zhongxun holding the child of the Panchen Lama in the 1980s. And then what's interesting about his career is that he was managing Tibetan affairs in the 50s and the 80s, which, as you've heard earlier, these were two periods of relative openness. And in the 80s, as the sort of right-hand man to Hu Yaobang on the Secretariat, he was in charge of a lot of different issues, but they included Tibet, Xinjiang, religious affairs. And we now have a lot of material from China that have been that are now available at American universities. Some of those are documents that are still technically classified, but somehow fell off the back of a bus and ended up in certain American institutions, sort of like WikiLeaks, as well as a lot of memoirs that have never been published. But I've also tried to do my best to get a better sense from the Tibetan side. And we actually have verbatim transcripts from memoirs written by Tibetans who were visiting Beijing in the 1980s as part of these delegations that include page after page after page of Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping's views on the negotiations with Dharamsala during that time. And one thing that really stuck out to me looking at these new sources is that on the Chinese side, they were very serious about these talks with Dharamsala and did hope that the Dalai Lama would ultimately be able to return. He also, Xi Zhongxun, wasn't just an outward-facing individual towards the Dalai Lama, but was also involved in some rather cutthroat political struggles with different individuals who had a different view, in particular a man named Infa Tang, who was in charge of the Tibet Autonomous Region. They feuded viciously, actually, with Xi Zhongxun wanting a more open, liberal model in Tibet. And I'll just briefly conclude by, first of all, saying what a treat it was to hear these stories, but also from the Sikyong, how his historical memory has been shaped by his understanding of this period, and some things that came to mind with someone as the background that just described to you. The first was whether or not the hangups that were there in the 1980s that led to the collapse of the talks are still present during the negotiations today. So when I look at the transcripts of these private discussions, one issue was the size of Tibet, right? Whether it was the Tibet Autonomous Region or would include those other two regions in Qinghai and Sichuan as well, whether the Dalai Lama would be a purely ceremonial figure and live in Beijing and not go to Tibet except in certain circumstances, and whether or not the level of autonomy would change. So you would see the Tibetans saying, we want something like one country, two systems, like you're presenting for Taiwan, and then Xi Jinping saying, but Tibet has already gone through reform, so that's why it's not like Taiwan. Also, interestingly, there would be these meetings with people lower than Xi Jinping that wouldn't go well. And then when Xi Jinping would meet the delegates, he would say, I want to remind you that talking is good for talking's sake. We need to keep these conversations going, even if they don't go anywhere. Another thing that struck me was the role of back channel negotiations. So there was lots going on that we didn't know at the time. In fact, there was a secret interlocutor between Xi Jinping and Dharamsala who helped keep things moving. I'm curious about whether or not Dharamsala is conscious of the Xi family role and whether they try to use it in the negotiations now. I saw a video of the Dalai Lama saying to a Chinese reporter that he has shaken the hand of Mao Zedong and now wants to shake the hand of Xi Jinping. He also had these beads that he wanted to be given to Qi Xin, who is Xi Jinping's mother, believing that she had a Buddhist belief. I also thought of a speech that I saw Lodi Yari give on YouTube, in which he was very reflective about Hu Yaobang, saying that in some ways the Tibetans should have realized the chance that they had with him and might have been able to do more. And finally, and I'll conclude with this, is in the 1950s and the 1980s, there was this narrative among conservatives that when you stop trying to destroy splitists, when you stop having a very proactive control model, what happens isn't that you co-opt individuals by persuading to them that the CCP is in a new, moving in a new direction, but they take that new space and sort of motivated by growing expectations, become more ambitious in a way that they're not able to handle. I don't want to say that this is, of course, the correct view, but as a sort of devil's advocate, that, as I understand it, looking at these sources, were the conclusion that was reached in the 1980s. As you mentioned, the speech by the Dalai Lama, both in the United States and in Strasbourg in the 1980s, the view in Beijing, some believe that the problem was still overcoming problems of the Cultural Revolution, needing to address grievances. But increasingly, as the protests were taking place in Lhasa, that ultimately the view that when you let up, you just have those kind of protests, you don't actually satisfy people, ended up being triumphant. So those were just some reactions I had as someone who's coming at it from this particular direction. But again, it was a real honor to sit up here and hear from you, given that this is what I'm interested in.
So since there are lack of microphones, I guess I'm going to stand here. Yeah, I don't know if the others want to react to that. The other panelists. Any reactions? No? We can move on to Anderson, who has been waiting patiently. Anne is a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins Science. Yep.
Yes, hello. So first of all, Tashi, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for putting this together. It's just been a wonderful, wonderful day. It's been very moving. I have certainly learned a great deal. And I think we all owe you a deep debt of gratitude. That's the most important thing I want to say. But some of these discussions have sparked me to think about things that I hadn't thought about and to want to say things that I hadn't planned to say. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I am a China specialist, not a specialist on Tibet. But I've had a very long interest in Tibet, and I have also done two very, very meaningful things to me directly related to Tibet. I have heard Gyalo Dundrup's name mentioned several times today, the older brother of the Dalai Lama. And I am the person who went to Colloquium and interviewed him to write his autobiography. And that, I should say, is thanks to Elsie Walker, who is sitting back there. And Elsie, he's 92 years old. I think it's time for us to visit him again. And then the second thing, I was just so moved by Arjia Rinpoche's descriptions of Qinghai. And I have to say that I paid my first visit to Qinghai in 2001. And I think I only got as far as Xining and the sort of local area around Xining, and I loved it. And somebody said, well, if you love Xining, you would really love Yushu, Jegu, which is like hundreds of miles away and 15,000 feet high. And so in 2003, I paid my first visit to Jegu. And the morning after I arrived, my host called me up and he said, something very special is happening here today. The reincarnated Lama of the Jegu monastery is coming back to his monastery for the first time in his life. And the procession is going to pass in front of my house and you have to come see it. So of course I went and saw that procession and it changed my life. I have to say that to end that part of the story, it took me 13 years. He came to Jegu. He was, welcomed by all of his constituents, his Buddhist friends, and then wasn't allowed to stay. And he disappeared. And it took me 13 years to find him. But a few years ago, I was in Dharamsala and I was giving a lecture. And I told that story. And somebody said, well, he's my Lama. And I went like a couple of days later to Dehradun and met him. And it was just marvelous because we remembered exactly the same things. He was just as marvelous a person as I thought he would be. Okay, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story about Jegu is that that same in 2003, I was also introduced to a man who was trying to set up an NGO. And I was very taken with his ideas. I was very taken with what he wanted to do. And I was able, pretty quickly to start raising money to allow him to establish this one big overarching NGO, but that then we built throughout the Tibetan Plateau. We were able to reestablish and fund probably about 20 NGOs. A lot of the work was devoted to poverty relief, but also a lot of the work was sort of teaching participatory democracy. And all of the work we did, for all of the work that we did, we used a methodology called open space. And open space, it really starts with the problem, but it's very, very participatory. It's very, very democratic. It needs a leader, but it's a sort of iterative process where you identify problems, where you discuss the problems, and then you come up with plans about how to solve those problems. So for a number of years, I worked with those NGOs across the Tibetan Plateau until in 2014, it all sort of stopped. But those are the two things that I've done related to Tibet. I guess the one that I've just found this whole discussion very, very interesting. And I guess the question for me is, where do we go from here? I feel like we need more sessions like this. We need to bring people together more often. And I also think one step further is, like, we could use this participatory methodology of open space to bring people together. And I was particularly taken with, what was I lost my train of thought. In any case, I think I was particularly taken with Tashi's trying to bring Tibetans and Chinese together. And I think if there's any way we could work to do that, that it would be good. And again, that open space methodology would be a good way to start that. So again, thank you to Tashi, and this has been a wonderful day.
That's really too kind, and I don't know if people want to jump in at this point, or shall we go straight to the audience? Because I know people have been waiting so long, starting with no? Okay, I see lots of hands, which this one is very insistent. Yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for all of you guys. Providing like different perspective. I personally feel like, wow, it's really amazing and learn a lot. My name is John, and I'm a second year student at GW. I study system engineering with data analysis concentration. I'm a Chinese national, and the way I grew up, the way I was being educated at school about Tibet wasn't that much, but mostly about the history of how the farm slaves before the Tibet was being liberated by Chinese Liberation Army. Also, after that, a little bit about how Dalai Lama is escaped from Tibet. So my question was, Honorable Sokyam Penpa, you mentioned that you grew up in India, where the Tibetan government excels located. A lot of other Tibetan also live overseas. So you mentioned also you feel like you are more Indian sometimes than being Tibetan. But a lot of other, I feel like other Tibetan youth I've been friends with, they feel they have this, back in China, they feel have this dual citizenship, or not dual identity, being both Tibetan and Chinese. So with the developing of the Tibetan economy, also a lot of Tibetan youth especially have more and more affiliation towards China, or being a Chinese Tibetan. So my question was, in the future, how the youth from abroad, Tibetan youth from abroad, how they relate to the youth back in China, because I think there will be a gap of the identity. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. what you learn in China about Tibet is what the Chinese government wants you to learn about China or Tibet. So you have to do your own research to understand what Tibet was or what China was. I cannot say for sure that I'm very proud of the system that we had in place in Tibet, because that was how it used to be. And you can also study about how China was. And I'm more ashamed of what Chinese government did during those times than more with the Tibetan system in Tibet those days. When I said our thinking is more like Indian, it's because even in Tibet, this goes back to 7th, 8th century, when Buddhism came to Tibet, the whole Tibetan way of life changed. That's why it's not just me, it's inside Tibet also, because we practice Buddhism that came from India. That's why it's not necessarily to differentiate between Tibetans who are born in India or born in Tibet who think like Chinese, or born in India think like Indians, because every Tibetan who has the freedom to practice Buddhism is shaped by the spirituality of teachings, tenets of the Buddhist thinking. So irrespective of whether you're born in India or whether you're born in Tibet, your way of thinking is guided by Buddhist teachings. So that when I say physically I'm Tibetan, but mentally I'm Indian, that does not necessarily mean to say that I have become Indian. I'm still Tibetan, but I have spiritual guidance of Buddha's teachings. Then when you say Tibetans, young Tibetans inside Tibet have more affiliation towards Chinese or being Chinese, the dual identity of Tibetan and being Chinese. The irony, of course, is people are not happy inside Tibet. If the Chinese government, somebody I think already mentioned, Yugang also mentioned, if the Chinese government really considers Tibet as part of China, then they should treat the Tibetans also equally, not differentiate people. So why is the Chinese government treating the Tibetan Chinese inside China like the Uyghurs or the Tibetans? No, there is a lot of discrimination. There is a lot of marginalization of these cultures, very precious to us. So I cannot say for sure that the Tibetans inside Tibet has its Chinese identity. But if you look at this number of self-immolations, 158, 157 Tibetans who self-immolated, and many of them are very young people who have not witnessed cultural revolution, but they see currently as to what the Chinese government is doing inside Tibet. And it's not as if Tibetans can't take to violence. We have history of violence in our own history, but His Holiness makes sure that Tibetans don't take up violence. That's why His Holiness mentioned many times that if you take up violence, I'm not going to be responsible for the Tibetan movement. That also deters the Tibetans from taking up violence. Why do you think the Tibetans are not killing the Chinese but self-immolating themselves? There's this motivation behind, to tell the Chinese government that we are suffering, you are destroying us. Why don't you listen to us? Why don't you hear our aspirations? So that is the problem. Chinese government, everybody talks about, you talked about development in Tibet. That's true. There is physical development, material development. But does development alone bring peace of mind? Because all Tibetans have been practicing Buddhism over 1,300 years. So to bring peace of mind, even in America, material development alone does not bring happiness. So you have to have the freedom to practice your religion. And that China is depriving us to do so. There is, you talk about, I think Yugang also talked about monasteries being rebuilt, but the physical facade of religious freedom alone does not help or bring happiness to the mind of the people. So then why does Chinese government restrict so much on religion? Why can't people practice them? It's not just us. You talk about Falun Gong people, you talk about Christians in China. Why is Chinese government so much against religion? And now you are talking about Buddhism with Chinese characteristics. Can I have a definition of what is Buddhism with Chinese characteristics? Or maybe communist characteristics? How can communists have Buddhism when they don't practice? And they want to be responsible for reincarnation of what Chinese call as living Buddhas. You know? So when you don't know Buddhism, when you don't practice Buddhism, how can you be responsible for reincarnation of lamas? That is why His Holiness always has a very, His Holiness says in jest, and His Holiness always has a very humorous side to it. And I repeat this many times, when His Holiness, if the Chinese government, the communist government is really serious about reincarnation, first they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation. Then second, Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation. Maybe the Dalai Lamas. And today in Tibet, why do you have huge pictures of Xi Jinping, huge pictures of Mao, Deng, Zhang, Hu in the monasteries? Do they want to be worshipped like Tibetan Buddhas or the living Buddhas or the Lamas? There are so many contradictions in what is written there in the Constitution and what is being practiced, what is spoken and what is implemented. So if you bridge those gaps, I understand that China's Constitution is one of the best constitutions in the world if it is practiced in the spirit of what is written there. But unfortunately, it is not. So, so the identity now, the problem is China wants to change the identity of the Tibetan people. That has been the process over the last 50 years, 60 years to sinification of Tibet, or Hanification of Tibet, or whatever you call it. So that process should stop. We all, every one of us, appreciate multiculturalism. It's happening everywhere. How do you think the Chinese Communist government can stop multiculturalism in China? We are also not against multiculturalism, but we are against a majority community completely overwhelming a minority community and destroy their identity, turn them into people they don't want to be. So why such force? Why such repression on people's mind that you don't have the freedom to think, freedom to talk, freedom to move? So this needs to be restored. Only then will there be trust between the Chinese leadership or the people they rule. So there is now a huge deficit of trust. So to build trust, you have to listen to people. You have to understand people's aspirations. So people, Tibetans inside want to maintain their identity, but China wants to change it. For whose benefit? I don't understand. That's why I mentioned in my presentation also that one of our jobs would be to tell the Chinese government, these are the policies and programs that you are implementing inside Tibet today. And these are not helping the Tibetans as a people, nor China as a nation. So if Chinese leadership, I'm not talking about Chinese people like you and me, we are all same human beings. We are just separated by boundaries. We are separated by names of ethnicities and people. But we are all same human being. That's why His Holiness always talks about 7 billion people. We are all same. So why so much repression? Just for political power? Why did communism come into being? And what is communism today in China? So everything you justify with Chinese characteristics. So who are real Chinese? Again, I know you have academic discussion about who is the real Chinese, whether it's the Han Chinese, or the Mongols also Chinese, Manchus also Chinese, Tibetans also Chinese. I watch some Kung Fu movies. I watch some Kung Fu. Whenever I watch these movies, the protagonists are Chinese. And the enemy is always, the antagonist is always the Manchus. So that means that culturally it shows that Manchus have invaded China. The Yuan Mongols have invaded China. So it's not the same people. If the Mongols are also Chinese, then China might claim half of Europe, where Genghis Khan went. So there can be a lot of academic discussions, but we have to look at the reality of the situation. Now, past is past. You call Tibetan a slavery or whatever. It's not slavery in the sense of medieval Europe or other things. It's in a total different cultural and political situation we are talking about, of that age, of that time, of the system that was prevailing at that time. But now Chinese government always talk about, even just day before yesterday, they still call His Holiness a separatist. And the whole world knows that His Holiness has proposed the middle way approach. So sometimes I really wonder whether the Chinese government want Tibet to be separated, and who's doing that? It's the Chinese government who is doing that, not us. Even today, I said we are committed to middle way approach. So we are not seeking separation. But Chinese government always calls us separatists. So these are contradictions that needs to be. Chinese government has to go in tune with the reality of times. Now, in this age and time, you can't expect the world to be fooled. The only thing you can do, the Chinese leadership can do, is to fool the Chinese inside Tibet or Chinese inside China. And they do that only because they want the Communist Party to continue their rule. They have to change their mindset. Now you are living in the United States. You have the freedom to speak. I know you have your own conscience. I understand that. And you ask the question also because people are listening. This will also go out and go to the Chinese government also. So I hope no harm comes to you. There should be no problem speaking your mind. And as I mentioned before, even if we want, we can't take Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Pacific or Atlantic. So we have to live as neighbors. There is no choice. So if as neighbors, we have to live in peace and harmony. We can't be boxing with each other every day. So we have to learn to live in peace, and I hope the general population of China also thinks in a similar way, because just Joseph also mentioned about Xi Dongshun. And then Rinpoche mentioned about the leaders in the Communist Party and their respect for Buddhism. Xi Dongshun himself had so much respect for Panchen Rinpoche. Xi Dongshun had met with His Holiness. We also know of Xi Jinping's wife who received tankas from India, signed by His Holiness. So those angles are there. I know so many lamas who has patrons in the Communist Party. So why two-face? Why have two faces? Just have one face and a genuine face. And don't think about losing your face. Because if there is a face, then that is your face. You don't lose, you don't gain. It's your face. And just be genuine about it. Okay?
I'd also like to say that I really appreciated that question as well. Of course, it's something that requires a very long conversation. So we have a sign-up sheet going around. If anybody in the DC area, especially, wants to stay in touch with the programs that we're running, not just about Tibet and China, but many places, but especially Tibet and China, we'll be building programs around. Please sign that form so we can stay in touch with you. And I'm also told that we're living on borrowed time. So, but this is such a wonderful opportunity. Let's take two more questions, put them on the table, and then our roundtable can answer if they want. So we'll just collect two questions.
My name's Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I recognize this is highly improbable, but I'm going to put it on the table anyhow. The Northern Ireland solution is one in which we handle the money, you fly our flag, we handle foreign policy, everything else is up to you, Northern Ireland. Post Xi Jinping for sure, and probably post Communist Party, is there any chance the Northern Ireland solution would meet the needs of the Tibetan people? Or is the fact that so many Tibetans are outside the Tibetan Autonomous Zone an impediment to the Northern Ireland solution?
We tried to, but that's such a good one. So I think this is the last answer.
In terms of solutions for Tibet, I think there are all kinds of possibilities. When I spoke a little bit earlier, I did mention Tibetan areas under parts of several Chinese provinces, but I didn't want to mention that all these Tibetan areas are contiguous, and there's a whole argument Tibetans present, because I know many China scholars and experts are speaking, and I didn't want our conversation to go into black and white kind of thing. But Professor Gang Yu actually mentioned it, and he said, it's nothing new. The Tibetans are in a contiguous area. So what I'm trying to say is that there are Chinese scholars, there are Chinese leaders who are open to any kind of proper resolution, whether it's the Northern Ireland solution that I mentioned. And China needs to look at all these possibilities. And it's not that it hasn't been talked about. Chinese scholars, democracy advocates, after the Tiananmen Square, had many big, shall we say, meetings all over the world. And among different ideas discussed was this big idea of the confederation of China. That unless you had a new system that took care of everyone on a somewhat equal basis, there was no way you're going to settle the Tibet issue. There's no way you're going to deal with Hong Kong properly. There's no way you're going to bring back Taiwan. So I think there's a range of possibilities. I think I'd just like to add that. And if I could add one word about the youth, I'm probably least suited because I think I'm the oldest on this.
You look younger than me.
I'm the oldest here, and I'm also a parent. And it's true, Tibetans who are growing up in America, in the West, are highly westernized already. You know, it takes 10 years, maybe less than 10 years, to become, used to a new cultural setting. And it's true of Tibetans in India. And it's true of Tibetans who are growing up now and studying in China. But it's not unique to the Tibetans. The whole world is changing, if I might say so. When I was much younger, in my 20s, if I might go back that much, the way people spoke English in India and America was very different. Even those who spoke English in England was very different from here, because I had the opportunity to hear all that. And in Europe, most people spoke French or German, I thought. But if you go on the news channels these days, everybody in the world is speaking English, and I might say very well. So linguistic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds are, changing tremendously. I don't know if you're going to blame the t-shirt or blue jeans, but some of the best Tibetan music are new raps coming out of Tibet. Okay? So younger people are taking on more than one identity. And if they are able to handle it well, and if we're able to handle it well, you can have more than one identity and you can keep the best parts of every identity. I think that's where the world is going to. As I said, I'm a parent and I want to be grandparents in a few years, but all of us will have to face that same issue.
So we said there would be one more question.
I'm a visiting scholar from Sichuan University. So as far as we know that actually these years, Tibetan people and Tibet has really changed a lot. So I visited some families in Tibet, and also I visited the whole area of Tibet. So as far as I know, I can see that Tibet really has developed a lot and is getting much richer than before. So, and also they enjoy a lot of specialities and special treatments and also welfare, which actually even us as Han Chinese, we are really jealous about those special, treatments, such as the students, they can enjoy extra scores at the college entrance examination. They enjoy higher salary. They enjoy, better retirement policies. So actually, not only Tibetan people, but also all ethnic groups in China. So, and also, of course, the government at the same time, they donated a lot of money to these ethnic group areas. So we wonder, whether these ethnic groups or Tibetan people really are appreciated about all these actions done by the Chinese government. As far as my conversation with some Tibetan families, they are really appreciated about the changes and also about the poverty lift overcome. It's we can see it's very obvious that all these areas really developed very well these years. So I wonder, of course, we all know that the repression problem, we all enjoy the same treatments. I'm also not happy with, such as freedom of speech. So, but I think to change our system, it needs really a long time, and also it needs our co-efforts to change it, right? So I really wonder whether it's Tibet think about some positive actions done by the Chinese government. Of course, we know all the negative points, right? And also, by the way, I don't think there's sort of negotiation table to put between China, the mainland and Tibet. So, of course, that's all the information we can get, especially in China. So I wonder whether you are going to still to do more efforts about to make Tibet independent. Thank you.
I don't know if people noticed a few weeks ago, there was a series of documents related to Xinjiang that were classified but were posted on a website dedicated to the Uyghur issue. And there is a comment that's very interesting that's made by Xi Jinping at a still technically classified speech in which he says, it's not only about economics in Xinjiang or Tibet. And he referenced the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he mentioned that the Baltic states were by far the most advanced, but they were the quickest to leave the Soviet Union, which suggests that the Chinese leadership doesn't believe that economics and economic growth are the only ways that they're using to solve the issue in Tibet and Xinjiang, but they also see this transformative project that you were talking about that involves changing Tibetan self-identity as another part of their agenda. And again, this is something that we've seen change over time within China. In the 1980s, Hu Yaobang, Xi Zhongxun, they saw the problem in Tibet as primarily one of addressing grievances from the Cultural Revolution and providing economic growth. But when you look at these internally circulated materials that we now have in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there is an explicit statement that that policy was wrong and that actually what the policy should be is combating splitism, just giving people more economic rights isn't the way to solve this problem. So I think that I'm seeing this as a purely economic problem that can only be solved with economic ways. Certainly that's something that the Chinese have identified as useful for addressing these challenges, but certainly isn't something that can completely resolve the situation.
Sensitive forward.
Right, yeah, we have definitely gone overboard, but I just want to give you a chance to, all the panelists to have closing thoughts.
Okay, Matt.
My last thought here, responding to our Chinese student from mainland, and also my fellow countryman from Sichuan province. 你好，我也是四川人。对，我从四川那个川师附中毕业。对， So, and the Chinese who toured Tibet, and the Chinese, especially who went to the earthquake zone in the year 2008, I have to say, I have some kind of different perspectives, because I saw the deep poverty in Tibet, and I saw the devastation in the Chinese countryside. In every society, you always have the privileged people, and so I can say, I'm not from an unprivileged section in China. So therefore, I am not used to persecution or prejudice and injustice. This is one important reason. Sometimes I cannot accept when the other people, they're not treated equally as I am treated. So that's how I think in China, if we look at Shanghai, because I happen to be part of Shanghainese, because my wife is from Shanghai, married there. And so when we see the outcries from the Shanghai people, residents now, so can we imagine what's going on in China? And Shanghai is the most globalized city. And of course, Hong Kong happened, right? And it became dark. And Shanghai today is struggling. So if we just imagine beyond Hong Kong, beyond Shanghai, under the shadow, basically in the underworld, and what things can happen. So this I hope we are going to put things in the context. Last point I want to say, responding to our Chinese students. Here I had one quote in my slide. I said, standing in the middle of the road, right, it's very dangerous. You get knocked down by the traffic from both sides. That is said by Margaret Thatcher. I appreciate Dalai Lama's middle way approach because he tried to travel in the middle. But of course, Dalai Lama has been attacked by even Tibetans from both sides. We do have fanatics in Tibetan population, in the Chinese population. So if Dalai Lama can be defamed and in the Tibetan community by some Tibetans, and so you can understand, I am a Chinese, and I can be also brutalized by certain Tibetans. And so this is why I just want you to be aware, we are promoting Dalai Lama's midway approach, which is an official approach adopted by the Tibetan Central Administration and by the Tibetan People's Parliament. So what does that mean? It means they recognize the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China, recognize the constitution. But the problem is, and as I mentioned, the Tibetans, especially the diaspora, they're like the flowing rivers. They don't want to be solidified. They are seeking change. And they are dynamic. They're changing the whole world, especially Dalai Lama's compassionate leadership. And is what we need. Imagine if Putin, if Trump, if Xi Jinping, they can have a little bit of such kind of compassion, empathy, and sympathy. And I think our today's world would be much, much better. So I hope all of us, especially my Chinese friends, one thing we can learn from Dalai Lama is, at least, and he is a leader with empathy, sympathy, and compassion. This also, I think, and Professor Gang Yu, and he said, don't do harm. I think if all of us can stick to that bottom line, I hope our world will be better. Okay, thank you very much.
Because this is such a unique gathering, this is the first time that the CQM is traveling internationally. This is his first public address, so I'm going to give him a chance to say closing remarks if he has that to offer. I also wanted to mention, in response to that question earlier about Northern Ireland, that one of the experimental programs we do here through RIMS is to convene Chinese policy researchers from Beijing and other Chinese cities. Not only the Chinese will appreciate people from Mongolia, etc., many different institutions. And so they have come to the Basque Country to study how they have become one of the most successful autonomous regions in Europe. And we've started to bring Tibetans from Tibet to the Basque Country to themselves do field-based studies. So the point is that I think, reflecting what Ajahn was saying earlier about that there's more potential than we think. And I just wanted to put that out there, but I want to invite Pimutsinla to closing remarks.
There's a few things if the Chinese government is really serious about the welfare of people, they should look at the aspiration of the Tibetan people. At one time, just like you said, development. Chinese government thought that development is the key to resolve any kind of conflicts. That alone is not enough, as I mentioned before. So we need more peace of mind. So people should have the freedom to practice their religion, practice their language, and live the way they want to live. And there should be more information. Why is China hiding all this information? Why is there no access to information for people? Why does China want to keep the system so opaque, where few people rule and nobody knows what's happening? Even today, when we are talking about Xi Jinping's third term, we don't know what's happening. Yeah, in Dongnam, the place where they take all these major decisions. So there has to be transparency. You can't fool your people all the time. So I think nobody wants anarchy in China. So the best thing for the communist leader is to devolve communism to democracy. That will be good for both the Chinese people, Tibetan people, other people in China. That will be good for everybody. So bring democracy, bring transparency, bring free flow of information. Have codes, legal systems with procedures that will help everybody. Otherwise, if Chinese leaders continue the way they do, they will be thrown out one day. So they have to understand that before it happens, it's better to resolve all these issues peacefully so that Chinese, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, not just people inside China, but people around China and all over the world, people all over the world have peace and harmony. Thank you.
The final part about next steps forward of teacher engagement, we're going to table that because there's another event that's going to happen after this. And instead, we're going to continue the conversation over our dinner that's outside Tibetan refreshment. So I'll welcome you all to